Welcome to Whisper's Secrets. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the bell. Let's start. The desert wind was still clinging to his boots when Matthew Lawson stepped off the bus in his dusty hometown of Laredo, Texas, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder heavier with memories than gear, his heart hammering with a mixture of exhaustion, hope, and a gnawing hunger to finally be home, because after 6 brutal months deployed to Fort Irwin's desert training grounds as part of a rotational combat unit, after night exercises that left his body aching and endless drills designed to strip a man down and rebuild him stronger, after lonely nights writing letters that went unanswered more often than not, all he wanted was to step into his little yellow house on Pine Street, wrap his arms around his wife Emily, and kiss the soft crown of his 2-year-old son Josh, inhaling the scent of baby powder and home-cooked meals and everything he had fought to protect. And he told himself the silence from Emily over the last few weeks was nothing to worry about. Maybe she was busy, maybe the phone lines were bad, maybe raising a toddler alone had her so exhausted she just didn't have the strength to talk every night, and he forced the doubts out of his mind, gripping the plastic handle of a bouquet of gas station roses tighter, as he walked the familiar cracked sidewalks that led from the depot to his street, the evening sun bleeding gold across the roofs, the air thick with the smell of dust and distant barbecue. And every step closer made him lighter, made the long nights in the desert worth it, made the aching joints and blistered hands a small price to pay for the moment he would walk through the door and hear Emily gasp his name in joy. But when he turned onto Pine Street and saw his truck parked at an odd angle in the driveway, his younger brother Daniel's beat-up Dodge idling right behind it, a low prickle of unease slid down his spine, and he told himself maybe Daniel was helping out. Maybe he was there fixing something. Maybe he was checking in because family stuck together when one of their own was gone, and he pushed through the gate, his boots crunching on gravel, and up the porch steps 2 at a time, the roses trembling slightly in his grip, and when he opened the door, the house smelled wrong, not bad, just wrong, not like meatloaf or cinnamon candles but like sweat and something sweeter, heavier, and he froze in the doorway, his duffel slipping from his shoulder with a thud, as he heard a low, unmistakable sound from down the hall, the creak of the old brass bed frame he had spent months dreaming of returning to, the soft, breathy gasps that should have been sacred but now felt like knives against his ears, and for a heartbeat he stood paralyzed, the world narrowing to the size of a pinhole, the walls closing in, the cheap paneling and threadbare carpet and framed photos of Josh on the end table suddenly alien and mocking, and then he moved, slow and deliberate, down the hallway, each step hammering the coffin nails into the life he thought he still had, and he pushed open the bedroom door to find Emily, his Emily, tangled in the sheets, her hair a wild halo around her flushed face, and Daniel, his baby brother, the one he had taught to ride a bike, the one he had bailed out of his first drunk driving arrest, the one he had taken punches for in high school fights, moving over her with a familiarity that said this was no drunken mistake, no heat of the moment accident, but something planned, nurtured, fed while Matthew sweated and bled thousands of miles away for them, and for a long moment none of them moved, the only sound the whir of the ceiling fan and Matthew's own heartbeat pounding like a war drum in his ears. And then Daniel scrambled back, clutching a sheet around his waist, his face blanching to the color of milk, stammering something that sounded like, "I'm sorry, man, it's not what you think." But Matthew couldn't hear him, couldn't hear anything but the ringing roar of betrayal exploding in his skull, and Emily, God, Emily, had the gall to pull the blanket tighter around herself and whisper his name, not in shame or fear but almost in pity, and something inside Matthew cracked, something deep and primal, and he dropped the roses to the floor where they lay broken and forgotten like the promises they had once symbolized, and he turned and walked out of the room, down the hall, out the front door into the dying sunlight, his body moving on instinct because his mind had been detonated, and he stood on the porch, gripping the wooden railing until the splinters bit into his palm, staring out at a street that looked the same but was irrevocably different, and he thought about Josh, about the little boy sleeping somewhere in this house that no longer felt like his, and the rage that burned through him then was so hot, so pure, that he had to clamp his teeth together to keep from roaring it into the sky. And he thought about the letters he had written, folded carefully in the desert wind, poured his heart into for a woman who had lain in his bed with his blood, and the knowledge of that betrayal sank into his marrow like poison, and he thought about Daniel, about every memory tarnished now, every Christmas morning and baseball game and secret shared in the dark, all ashes now, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same again, that something fundamental inside him had died the moment he opened that door. And he stumbled down the porch steps, into the street, into a future that stretched before him like a blasted wasteland, and somewhere far off a dog barked, and a sprinkler hissed to life, and the world, indifferent and unforgiving, continued turning. Matthew Lawson didn't remember much of how he got from Pine Street to the cheap roadside motel 3 towns over, the kind of place with buzzing neon signs and stale cigarette smoke embedded in the walls, but he found himself there anyway, sitting on the edge of a sagging bed with his head in his hands, the dim light casting long, broken shadows across the peeling linoleum, and for a long time he just sat, letting the numbness spread through him like cold water filling a sinking ship, and the duffel bag sat untouched by the door, the roses he had once clutched so tightly still lying crushed and forgotten on the porch of the life he no longer had, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of shock and anger and sorrow, something quieter stirred, an aching, bewildered grief, the kind that doesn't scream but strangles, and he thought about calling someone, anyone. But who do you call when the 2 people you trusted most are the ones who carved you open? And he stared at the cracked screen of his old phone until the numbers blurred, until he dropped it onto the nightstand with a hollow clatter, and outside the window the world went on, indifferent to the shattering of his universe, the highway humming with cars heading somewhere, everywhere, anywhere but here, and he closed his eyes and saw their faces again, Emily's wide, startled eyes, Daniel's guilt-ridden grimace, and he wondered when it had started. Wondered if there had been signs he missed, late-night texts stolen, glances at family barbecues, excuses made too easily, and the shame of it burned hotter than the betrayal, the humiliation of realizing he had been played for a fool in his own home while he sweated under desert suns thinking about her smile, their future, a better life built on the back of his sacrifice, and he knew he couldn't go back, couldn't step foot into that house again, not without breaking apart completely. So he sat in that dingy room, counting the cracks in the ceiling, until exhaustion finally dragged him under into a fitful sleep filled with jagged dreams of homecomings turned into nightmares, and when he woke the next morning, the world outside was gray and heavy with an impending storm, and he checked out without a word, slipping back onto the highway like a ghost, driving aimlessly through the endless sprawl of small towns and empty fields, the landscape blurring until it didn't matter anymore where he was. Only that he wasn't there, and somewhere near the Oklahoma border, he pulled into a greasy diner, ordered black coffee he didn't drink, and stared out the window at the endless stretch of road, wondering what the hell came next for a man with no home, no wife, no brother, and a son he hadn't even gotten to hold yet because to walk back into that house would be to reopen wounds that might never close, and he thought about Josh, sweet Josh. And the knife twisted deeper because it wasn't the boy's fault, none of this was his fault, and yet how could Matthew fight for custody when he had nothing to offer but a duffel bag and a heart full of broken glass, and the thought of Emily raising Josh alongside Daniel, his brother, his blood, made him sick, but the courts didn't care about betrayal, only stability, appearances, and he had nothing but scars and a soldier's pension that barely covered gas, and so he drove on, letting the days bleed together, taking odd jobs where he could. Roofing, hauling, anything that paid under the table. Because paperwork meant explaining things he didn't want to explain, and nights he slept in the truck, in roadside motels, in fields under stars that seemed colder and farther away than they ever had in the desert, and sometimes he would catch himself reaching for his phone, thinking maybe, just maybe, there would be a message, an apology, a plea, but there was nothing, only silence stretching out like a noose. And the loneliness pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting, until he forgot what it felt like to be needed, to be loved, and months passed that way, a slow erosion of hope and identity, until one night, parked outside a gas station with nothing but a half-empty coffee cup and a pack of stale cigarettes to his name, he decided he couldn't keep running, not forever, and he drove back to Laredo, back to the town that had chewed him up and spit him out. Not because he believed in redemption, but because some ghosts have to be faced before they can be laid to rest, and when he pulled onto Pine Street for the first time in nearly a year, the houses looked smaller, meaner, the paint peeling and the lawns overgrown, and the yellow house at the end of the block stood dark, the porch light burned out, the mailbox leaning at a drunken angle, and he sat there a long time, engine ticking in the cool night air, until a light flicked on inside, a small square of warm gold in the dark, and he saw a shadow cross the window. Small and quick, and he knew, deep in his bones, that it was Josh, and the longing hit him so hard it stole his breath, but he stayed where he was, hidden in the shadows, because he had nothing to offer that boy now, no home, no future, nothing but the battered remnants of a man who had once believed in promises. And as the light went out and the house sank back into darkness, Matthew turned the key in the ignition and drove away, not because he wanted to, but because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is to leave them with their illusions intact, and the road stretched out before him, endless and merciless, and he gripped the wheel tighter and drove into the night, carrying with him only the memory of what could have been. Matthew Lawson drove through the night with no real destination, just a vague sense that if he kept the wheels turning long enough, maybe the pain wouldn't catch up with him. But pain has a way of settling into the cracks of a man, no matter how far or how fast he runs, and by sunrise he found himself pulled over on the shoulder of a deserted farm road somewhere deep in the Texas Panhandle, the sky stretching endlessly above him in a bleak, merciless blue, and he sat there for hours, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the dust swirling across the asphalt, thinking about everything and nothing all at once. And when he finally climbed out of the truck and stretched his aching legs, he felt every one of those lost months heavy in his bones, the weight of betrayal and loneliness and wasted sacrifice anchoring him to the dirt, and for a time he lived like that, scraping together day labor where he could find it, fixing fences, hauling junk, repairing roofs for cash under the table, drifting from town to town like a man trying to outrun his own shadow, and people didn't ask questions because men like him weren't rare out here. Veterans with calloused hands and hollow eyes who carried their stories like invisible scars, and he told himself he didn't need more than that, didn't need friends or family or a future, just enough gas in the tank to keep moving and a place to lay his head at night. But the truth was harder to choke down with each passing day, the truth that some part of him still longed for connection, for something solid in a life that felt like it was crumbling a little more every time the sun went down. And it was in a dusty little town called Mineral Wells that he found temporary refuge, picking up steady work at a scrapyard run by a gruff old man named Hank who didn't care about backgrounds or resumes as long as you showed up on time and didn't steal, and the work was brutal. Hauling rusted beams, breaking down twisted metal, breathing in the sharp tang of burning oil, but it filled the hours, dulled the edges of his mind, and at night he rented a room above a boarded-up diner, a sagging mattress and a cracked window his only companions, and it was there, staring at the water-stained ceiling one sleepless night, that he realized he couldn't keep living as a ghost, that if he didn't carve some kind of meaning out of the wreckage, he'd vanish altogether, and so he started small, fixing up the battered old truck he'd nearly abandoned a dozen times, sanding down the rust, patching the engine, cleaning it until it shone under the grime, and as he worked, something unfamiliar stirred inside him, not hope exactly, but the memory of it, the ghost of a man who once believed in second chances, and with Hank's grunted permission, he started salvaging scraps after hours, welding them together into rough sculptures, abstract shapes at first. Twisted metal birds and hollow trees, then more detailed pieces, an eagle mid-flight, a pair of hands reaching skyward, and he didn't know why he did it, didn't think anyone would care, but the act of creating, of bending something broken into something new, gave him a focus he hadn't had in months, maybe years, and word got around, as it always does in small towns, and one afternoon a woman named Claire from the local community center came by, asking if he'd consider displaying a few pieces at the annual Harvest Festival, and Matthew almost laughed in her face, the idea seemed so absurd. But something in her earnestness, her belief that his work had value, chipped away at his resistance, and he agreed, half out of pity, half out of a desperate need to feel seen again, and when the festival came and he stood awkwardly beside his rough sculptures under the blazing autumn sun, he braced for indifference, for pity. But instead people stopped, looked, lingered, asked questions, shook his hand, called his work honest and raw. And though he shrugged it off, inside something cracked open, something that had been rusted shut since the night he walked into that bedroom and found his world burning down around him. And after that, things shifted, not fast, not dramatically, but enough to matter. Claire introduced him to other veterans working with metal and wood, men who spoke little but understood the language of brokenness and rebuilding, and slowly, painfully, Matthew began piecing together a new life from the scraps of the old one, and yet even as he moved forward, the past clung to him, a constant low hum in his blood, and he thought often of Josh, the little boy he had left behind, the son he had never truly known, and some nights he would sit in the truck under the vast, star-punched sky and imagine driving back to Laredo, knocking on that door, standing tall and saying, "I'm your father." But every time he pictured it, he saw Emily's face, Daniel's smirk, the betrayal that would never fully wash clean, and he stayed where he was, rooted by fear and shame and the deep, unshakable belief that he had already failed the boy too completely to ever be welcome in his life again. And so he worked, and he built, and he survived, stacking small victories like fragile bricks against the relentless wind of regret, and he told himself that maybe that was enough, maybe survival was its own kind of redemption, and though he smiled more easily now, laughed sometimes without forcing it, there was always a hollow space inside him, a missing piece shaped like a child he had never gotten to raise, a life he had never gotten to live, and he carried it with him, silently, as the seasons turned and the dust rose and fell, as the sun beat down and the rains came and went, and in the quiet, hard-won peace of his new life, he learned to live not without sorrow, but alongside it, a scar woven into the fabric of the man he had become. The winter crept in slow and mean across the Texas plains, turning the mornings sharp with frost and the evenings heavy with a kind of silence that seemed to settle deep into the bones of the town, and Matthew Lawson wrapped himself tighter in his worn jacket as he locked up the scrapyard each night, feeling the cold seep into him but welcoming it somehow, like penance for the mistakes he couldn't undo. And though the days still passed in a haze of grinding work and rough camaraderie among the other men, there were cracks in his armor now, moments when the isolation clawed a little too deep, when he would catch himself staring too long at families laughing over steaming cups of coffee in the diner or at fathers throwing footballs to their sons in the brittle, dead grass of the public park, and it was during one of those long, brittle evenings that Claire found him again, her breath visible in the air as she asked if he would consider teaching a welding class at the community center. Just a few hours a week, for some of the kids who had nothing better to do than get into trouble, and though every instinct in him screamed to retreat, to avoid entanglements, to keep his world small and safe, he heard himself saying yes, maybe because the thought of passing on something, anything, to someone who might actually want it felt like a way to pay back a debt he couldn't name. And so he found himself standing awkwardly in a drafty back room of the center a week later, explaining to a handful of restless teenagers how to hold a torch properly, how to feel the metal respond beneath their hands, and to his surprise they listened, not perfectly, not without the eye rolls and sarcasm that came with their age, but there was something hungry in them too, a need to create, to shape, to leave a mark on a world that seemed intent on forgetting them. And in their awkward enthusiasm Matthew found a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, purpose, fragile but real, and the days began to shift, the weeks gathering momentum, and soon his small welding class grew, kids dragging friends along, bringing projects to work on after hours, building not just sculptures but confidence, a belief that they could take something broken and battered and turn it into something strong and beautiful, and watching them, Matthew realized he was slowly welding himself back together too, piece by piece. Not into the man he had been but into something new, something tempered by fire and loss and quiet resilience, and yet even as he rebuilt, the ghosts of Laredo haunted him, shadows that lengthened with every milestone missed, every birthday uncelebrated, every school play he wasn't there to see, and late at night, when the world was still and the only sound was the distant hum of the highway, he would sit in the truck, the cold bleeding through the thin metal, and whisper apologies to a boy who might not even remember his face, And it was on one of those nights, after a charity event at the center where his students had shown off their sculptures to a crowd of proud, teary-eyed parents, that Claire sat beside him on the tailgate, nursing 2 lukewarm coffees and talking about everything and nothing until the conversation drifted, inevitable and painful, to his past, and for the first time, Matthew told someone the whole story, the deployment, the betrayal, the exile he had chosen for himself. And when he finished, bracing for judgment or pity, Claire simply looked at him, her eyes steady and sad, and said, "You deserve better." And something inside him cracked again, but this time it wasn't the shattering of pain, it was the slow, tentative breaking open of a heart that had been locked behind barbed wire for too long, and over the weeks that followed, their friendship deepened, rooted not in grand gestures or forced intimacy but in the quiet, daily accumulation of trust, shared meals, long drives down empty roads, silent company on evenings too heavy to bear alone. And without realizing it, Matthew began to hope again, not in the naive, wide-eyed way he once had, but with the wary, battered hope of a man who knows exactly how much it costs to believe in anything. And when spring crept back over the land, softening the hard edges of winter, the community center organized a larger exhibition for all the local artists, and Claire insisted that Matthew display his work. Not the rough, early pieces he had sold for gas money, but the newer ones, the ones forged with patience and pain and reluctant grace. And standing in that hall, surrounded by strangers admiring what he had built from the wreckage of his life, Matthew felt something shift inside him, something essential, and he realized that while the past would always haunt him, it no longer defined him, and maybe, just maybe, there was still room ahead for something more than survival. Maybe there was even room for forgiveness, not for Emily or Daniel, but for himself, for the man who had tried and failed and tried again, and who now stood, battered but unbroken, ready to step into whatever came next. The days after the exhibition passed like scenes from a life Matthew Lawson almost didn't recognize as his own, quieter and warmer than anything he had allowed himself to imagine in the long, bitter months since the night everything he believed in crumbled. And though the work at the scrapyard continued, the clanging of rusted steel, the acrid sting of welding smoke in his nostrils, the aching muscles at the end of each shift, there was a different weight to it now, a purpose that went beyond mere survival, because now, when he walked into the community center in the evenings and saw the teenagers bent over their projects, sparks flying as they shaped old metal into something defiant and new, he felt a pride that had nothing to do with glory or money and everything to do with reclamation. And outside of work, his world continued to expand, not quickly, not without fear, but steadily, with Claire at the center of it. Her laughter filling the spaces he thought would stay empty forever. Her easy silences just as precious as her words, and though either of them rushed to define what was growing between them, there was an understanding, a deep, unspoken acknowledgement of the broken places they both carried and the strange, miraculous fact that those jagged edges seemed to fit together somehow, and Matthew found himself looking forward to things again, late-night coffee runs after class, small road trips to neighboring towns to scavenge scrap for the kids' projects, evenings spent sitting in the back of her pickup watching the stars push against the velvet sky, and he thought maybe this was what healing looked like, not forgetting, not pretending the wounds had never been there, but learning to live with them, to let them be part of you without letting them own you. And yet even in the slow, steady rebuilding of his life, the past found ways to remind him it hadn't released him entirely. And one afternoon, after a long day hauling twisted rebar and engine blocks, Hank found him leaning against the truck, thumbing through his phone with a frown, and grunted, "You've got a visitor." And before Matthew could ask, he saw her, Emily, standing awkwardly near the edge of the lot, her hair shorter now, her posture tighter, a small boy clutching her hand, and for a moment Matthew couldn't breathe because even from across the gravel he knew it was Josh, older now, taller, but unmistakably his, and he wiped his hands on his jeans and walked slowly toward them, heart hammering in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to turn and run or rage or collapse. But he kept walking, and when he stood before them, the world narrowed to the space between their eyes, and Emily spoke first, her voice roughened by something more than nerves, and she said she was sorry, that she hadn't known how to find him, that things with Daniel had fallen apart not long after Matthew left. That she had been scared and ashamed and didn't know how to ask him to forgive the unforgivable, and Matthew listened without speaking, his gaze fixed not on her but on Josh, who peered up at him with wide, solemn eyes that held none of the betrayal, none of the anger, only a tentative hope that twisted the knife deeper. And Emily said she hadn't come to beg or to explain but to offer him the chance to know his son if he wanted it, and then she stepped back, giving him space. And Matthew dropped to a knee so he could look Josh in the eye and said softly, "Hey, buddy." And Josh smiled, shy and uncertain, and in that moment something inside Matthew shifted again, not with the violent shattering of the past but with the painful, deliberate setting of a bone that had been broken too long, and he realized that whatever had been taken from him, whatever trust, whatever dreams, this boy was his blood, his chance to build something real and good from the wreckage, and so he nodded, blinking against the sudden sting in his eyes, and said, "I'd like that." And over the following weeks they began slowly, awkwardly, painfully rebuilding something that resembled a relationship, weekend visits at first, long walks where Josh chattered about school and soccer and the stray dog he wanted to adopt, hesitant questions about where Matthew had been and why he stayed away so long, and Matthew answered them with as much honesty as he could without staining the boy's innocence with the bitterness of adult betrayals, and Claire, with the quiet understanding that had become her signature, stepped back enough to let him find his footing but remained close enough to catch him if he stumbled, and little by little, the walls around Matthew's heart crumbled, not with dramatic gestures but with small, stubborn acts of grace. A child's hand slipping into his, a girl's laughter drifting through an open window, a town that once felt like a prison blooming into a place he could call home. And as spring bled into summer, and the cicadas sang their timeless songs, Matthew stood in the center of his life, battered and scarred and painfully, gloriously alive, and he understood, finally, that true redemption isn't about erasing the past or pretending the scars don't exist, it's about carrying them forward, letting them shape you without defining you, and finding a way to build something stronger from the wreckage, something real, something worth fighting for. The heat of summer settled heavy over Mineral Wells, the air thick with dust and cicada song, and as Matthew Lawson stood under the awning of the community center, watching Josh sprint across the cracked asphalt with a soccer ball at his feet and Claire laughing from the sidelines with the other volunteers, he realized that somewhere along the long, brutal road he had stopped surviving and started living again. Not because the past had loosened its grip entirely, because it hadn't, because some wounds scab over but never quite heal, but because he had chosen, day after grinding day, to build something new out of the broken pieces, and in doing so he had found a life he hadn't dared hope for back when he sat in the dark, broken and lost, breathing through grief like it was poison, and it wasn't perfect. Some nights he still woke with the taste of betrayal thick in his mouth. Still felt the old rage coil low in his gut when he thought too long about Daniel's smirk, or Emily's pity. But those moments passed now like distant storms instead of anchors dragging him under, and when he looked at Josh, at the way the boy's face lit up when he scored a goal or built a birdhouse in Matthew's tiny garage workshop, he felt something deeper and stronger than the old anger. A fierce, almost aching gratitude for the chance to be here, now, not as the man he once was but as the man he had become. Shaped by fire and refusal and a stubborn, bone-deep belief that losing everything doesn't mean you have to lose yourself, and when Claire slipped her hand into his, warm and certain, he squeezed it gently, marveling at the simple miracle of connection, of trust rebuilt one heartbeat at a time, and the harvest festival approached, the 1-year anniversary of the first time he had dared show his work in public, and this time when Claire asked if he would speak, he said yes, not because he liked standing in front of crowds. He still hated it, but because he understood now that stories matter. That telling the truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts, is an act of defiance against the silence that betrayal breeds. And so when the night came and the community center buzzed with laughter and music and the smell of roasted corn and barbecue, Matthew stood on the makeshift stage, Josh perched proudly in the front row, Claire's steady presence at his side, and he told his story, not all the ugly details. Not the names or the betrayals, but the heart of it, how sometimes life takes everything you have, everything you thought you could trust, and burns it down to ash, and how you can choose, when the smoke clears, to either let it bury you or to sift through the wreckage and build something new, something stronger, something that no one can take away. And when he finished, the crowd stood silent for a long, breathless moment, and then the applause came, loud and sustained, and Matthew stepped down from the stage into the arms of his new life. A life not defined by the scars he carried but by the way he had chosen to wear them. And later that night, as he stood outside under the wide, endless sky, Josh asleep in the truck and Claire leaning against him with a contented sigh, he looked up at the stars and thought about the road that had brought him here, the desert sands, the long empty highways, the dingy motel rooms, the scrap yards and hollow nights, and he smiled, not with triumph or bitterness, but with a quiet, stubborn joy, because he knew now that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about finding a way to live again, to love again, to trust again, even when everything in you screamed against it. And in that moment, under the vast, indifferent beauty of the night sky, Matthew Lawson finally forgave, not Emily, not Daniel, but himself, and with that forgiveness, he stepped fully into the life he had fought so hard to claim. A life forged not in the absence of pain but in the relentless, defiant choice to keep moving forward. Thank you for being with us on Whisper's Secrets. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. The secrets are waiting to be revealed. See you soon.